The Postman of Willow Creek, Part 1. I wasn't supposed to stay in Willow Creek for more than a week. Originally, it was just a quiet detour, a place to rest between cities as I took the long way through the mountains. I'd rented a little cabin nestled at the edge of the woods, where pine needles blanketed the ground and the creek sang lullabies through the open windows at night. But the town had other plans for me. It started with the postman, an older man with a kind face and a beard that looked like it had grown tired of being trimmed. His name was Gerald, and he delivered the mail to every doorstep in Willow Creek by bicycle. Rain, shine, or snow, he pedaled through the winding gravel lanes with a woven basket full of letters strapped to the back. I met him on my second morning there. He waved at me as I sat on the porch sipping tea, then came right up the steps like we'd known each other for years. "You're the one in Elsie's old place," he said, peering at me over his wire-rimmed glasses. "She had a cat that used to follow me for half my route." I smiled. "I'm just here for a few days." "That's what a lot of folks say," he chuckled. "And then one day they realize the coffee tastes better here, and the clocks tick a little slower." That morning, Gerald didn't just hand me the mail. He handed me a story about the time the general store burned down in the 80s, and how the whole town pitched in to rebuild it in just 3 days. About the old woman who swore she could talk to birds, and the boy who once left town only to return 15 years later and open a tiny bookstore by the lake. Every day after that, Gerald would stop by for tea. And every day he'd tell me another story, sometimes his own, sometimes ones passed down like family recipes. Stories of wild foxes that knew how to open garden gates, or the time the northern lights came early and danced above Willow Creek like a slow, shimmering waltz. The days blended together gently. I started walking the wooded trail behind the cabin. Sometimes I'd find painted stones with kind messages hidden among the roots. "You are loved. This moment is enough." I found out later it was a little project the elementary school kids had started, and now everyone in town joined in. Evenings were for reading, or just listening to the creek. There was a spot where the water curved into a small pool, and dragonflies hovered above it like tiny helicopters. I started bringing a notebook there, jotting down thoughts I hadn't let myself think in years. Things slowed down in Willow Creek, not out of laziness, but reverence. One evening, Gerald brought over an old map and pointed out places he thought I should explore. "The bench at the end of Swan Trail, best sunrise you'll ever see," he said. "And if you ever need to hear silence, like the kind that feels like a hug, go to Maple Hollow. No birds, no breeze, just quiet." I didn't leave after a week. I didn't leave after a month, either. Willow Creek had gently wrapped itself around my spirit and reminded me that peace isn't something you chase. Sometimes it's waiting in a cup of tea, or the rustle of trees that have stood in the same place for 100 years. Part 2, Maple Hollow and the Quiet Kind of Magic. I took Gerald's advice about Maple Hollow one morning when sleep had been light and the sky was still painted in blue-gray dawn. I packed a thermos of coffee, an old flannel blanket, and my notebook, then followed the winding path that led out beyond the ridge behind the cabin. Maple Hollow wasn't marked on any modern map. You had to find it by memory or by heart. Gerald had drawn me a rough sketch on the back of a bakery napkin, a line through trees, a bend past a mossy boulder that looked like a sleeping bear, then 3 left turns, and a duck under a leaning cedar. And just like that, I was there. It wasn't much to look at, not in the usual way. No dramatic cliffs or glittering waterfalls. Just a wide open meadow ringed by maple trees that arched over like they were trying to hold hands. There were no birds, no wind. The air was still, like everything was listening. I sat down on the blanket, poured a cup of coffee, and just breathed. It's hard to explain the kind of quiet that lives in Maple Hollow. It wasn't empty, just full of things that didn't need to be said. Like being inside a deep exhale. My thoughts, usually a constant shuffle of ideas and plans and what-ifs, began to slow. I wrote down the first clear sentence I'd written in weeks. Maybe peace is just the absence of urgency. I stayed until the sun filtered through the branches, casting shadows that looked like lace across the grass. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking up with a leaf stuck to my cheek and the thermos warm beside me. Time in Willow Creek had this gentle way of folding in on itself. Back in town, I stopped by the tiny bookstore by the lake that Gerald had told me about. It was run by a man named Theo, who wore suspenders without irony and smelled faintly of cedarwood. He had a habit of reading the last page of any book before deciding to sell it. "I like to know how things end," he told me with a grin, "before I get attached." He handed me a weathered paperback with no title on the cover. "This one's about a lighthouse keeper who never lights the lamp because he believes the stars are enough to guide people home." I asked if he thought that was true. Theo shrugged. "Depends on the kind of traveler, I guess." That night, I read it in one sitting. There was something about the way the story unfolded, slowly, like fog lifting, that reminded me of Willow Creek itself. People here weren't in a hurry to tell you everything. They trusted time to do its part. One morning, a little girl named Hazel brought me a painted rock shaped like a turtle. She'd left it on my porch with a note that said, "You walk slow like my grandpa. That's good. Fast people miss the good stuff." I laughed out loud, and the sound startled a bluebird off the porch railing. Evenings turned golden. I started cooking again, not just for function, but with curiosity. There was a recipe passed around the town bulletin board for lavender lemon bread, and I made it twice just to get the glaze right. I brought a loaf to Gerald, who said it tasted like a summer afternoon sitting on your grandmother's porch swing. He wasn't wrong. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into a rhythm. I didn't check my phone much anymore. My inbox grew dust somewhere in a city I'd left behind. But here, in this small pocket of the world, I was remembered by name. The librarian greeted me with books she thought I'd like. The baker put aside a cinnamon twist every Friday, just in case you wander by. Even the dog who lived at the edge of the woods started walking part of the trail with me like a quiet, furry escort. Eventually, I stopped saying I was just visiting. Part 3, Letters Never Sent. Autumn arrived slowly, like someone knocking gently on your door before coming in. The air turned crisp but not cold, and the leaves on the maples began to whisper in golden tones. Even the creek sounded different, softer somehow, like it knew summer had bowed out. One morning, Gerald didn't come by with the mail. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe a flat tire on the bicycle, or maybe he'd stopped for an extra coffee at Millie's diner. But then the second day passed, and the third, and the space where he usually stood on my porch began to feel oddly empty. On the fourth day, I stopped by the little post office tucked behind the general store. The bell above the door jingled like it always did, and the scent of old paper and wood polish filled the room. Greta, the clerk, looked up with a smile. "He's fine," she said, before I could even ask. "Just took a few days off. First time in a decade." I must have looked surprised because she added, "He said someone else was already keeping the town company." I left the post office feeling both relieved and strangely honored. That afternoon, I opened the drawer of the little writing desk in the cabin, the one I'd barely touched since I arrived. Inside were a handful of envelopes, blank note cards, and an old fountain pen that still worked if you coaxed it. I started writing letters. Not to send, just to say what hadn't been said. One to my younger self, telling them it's okay not to have it all figured out. One to an old friend I hadn't seen in years, recounting the time we got lost on a hiking trail and ended up finding wild blackberries. One to someone I never properly thanked. The writing came easy, like the stories Gerald told, not rushed, not forced. Just truth, wrapped gently in memory. I didn't seal the letters, just stacked them on the desk like folded thoughts. Each day I'd add one more, sometimes short, sometimes pages long. They weren't for the people I addressed them to, not really. They were for me. For the quiet corners of my mind that hadn't seen sunlight in too long. One rainy morning, I brought the whole stack to the fire pit out back. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no cinematic music, no heavy symbolism. Just me, sitting in the drizzle, feeding one page at a time to the flames, watching the ink curl and vanish into the sky. I felt lighter afterward, like I'd left footprints in a place that didn't need roads. That evening, Gerald returned. No fanfare, just a knock on the door and a familiar smile. "Miss me?" he asked, handing over a small bundle of mail tied with twine. "Only a little," I grinned. "You inspired me to start a letter habit." He chuckled and reached into his coat pocket. "Well, then maybe you'll appreciate this." He handed me a small box. Inside was a simple letter opener with a carved wooden handle. "Made it myself," he said. "Maple from the hollow." I ran my fingers over the smooth surface. "It's beautiful." "So are your stories," he said, turning to leave. "I hear them in the wind now." That night, the wind had seemed to hum just a little differently, like it had picked up on something unspoken and decided to carry it forward. Part 4, First Snow and the Festival of Lights. It happened overnight, as if someone had quietly changed the channel while the town slept. Snow. Not a storm, not a blizzard, just a soft, honest snowfall that coated everything like powdered sugar on a warm loaf of bread. I woke to silence, the kind that only comes when the world is wrapped in white. Even the creek's voice was muffled beneath a layer of frost. I stepped outside in my thickest socks and watched my breath fog the air. Gerald's bicycle tracks were already visible, a pair of gentle lines etched into the snow like a story mid-sentence. Taped to my mailbox was a note in his handwriting. "Don't forget the Festival of Lights. Tonight, 6 p.m. by the lake. Dress warm, not brave. The Festival of Lights." I'd heard whispers about it, how the whole town gathered at the edge of the frozen lake, lanterns in hand, to honor both the year behind and the one ahead. No ads, no signs, just word of mouth, passed down like a recipe no one wrote down. At sunset, I bundled up and followed the winding path past the bakery, where cinnamon still danced in the air, and the bookstore, where Theo had hung a single candle in the window. A quiet symbol. We are here. Down by the lake, the snow reflected the last streaks of pink and gold sky. Dozens of people were already there, not in rows or lines, just scattered loosely, like stars deciding where to fall. Each person held a small lantern, some paper, some glass, some homemade with wire and jars. Millie from the diner handed me one without a word. It was shaped like a little pine cone, the kind you'd find along the trails behind the cabin. Inside, a tea light flickered patiently. The mayor, a woman named Ruth with laugh lines and snow in her hair, stepped forward with a lantern of her own. She raised it, and slowly, quietly, everyone followed suit. Not a speech, not a countdown, just a moment of shared breath. Then the lanterns were placed on the ice. One by one, they were set down gently, the flames protected by their shells. And then the wonder, they began to drift. Not across the surface, but downward. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. But no, the ice had frozen clear and deep, and beneath the surface, a thin layer of water allowed the lanterns to slide slowly under, suspended like glowing jellyfish in a still ocean. It was beautiful in a way I couldn't have prepared for. Gerald stood beside me and whispered, "It started with sailors. Back when the lake was part of a trading route. They believed the lanterns lit the way for safe returns. Then it became a way to remember. Not just the lost, but the moments we left behind." All around us, the lake shimmered with light. Children giggled as their lanterns danced across the ice. Adults huddled with cocoa and thermoses, and overhead, snowflakes began to fall again, slow and careful, like they didn't want to interrupt. I didn't take a single photo. Not because I forgot, but because I didn't want to remember it as a picture. I wanted to remember it the way I would a song, how it made me feel, not how it looked. That night, back in the cabin, I wrote just 3 words in my notebook. "This is home." I didn't know if I meant the place, the people, the rhythm, or just that moment on the ice. But I knew I'd carry it with me, wherever I went next. Part 5, The Thaw and the Story That Returned. Winter in Willow Creek doesn't end abruptly. It lingers like the last guest at a dinner party, reluctant to leave, still telling stories. But eventually, the frost pulls back its fingers, and the scent of earth returns. I first noticed the change on the trail to Maple Hollow. The snow was still there in patches, but the moss had begun to peek through. The trees stood taller, shaking off their winter silence. I heard birdsong for the first time in weeks, a single note, followed by another, like someone quietly tuning an old instrument. I found myself smiling more often, without realizing it. Smiling at nothing, or maybe everything. Gerald had switched back to his bicycle. He showed up one morning with a fresh cut on his hand, grinning like he'd just gotten away with something. Fell into a blackberry bush, he said, holding up his bandaged finger. First sign of spring, nature trying to remind you who's boss. I brewed us tea and we sat on the porch in sweaters, watching the steam curl from our mugs. He seemed quieter that morning, like a page between paragraphs. There's something I want to show you, he said eventually. Tomorrow, if you're free. I'm always free here, I said. He nodded. Good. It's something that found its way back to me. The next day, we walked instead of riding. Gerald carried a small wooden box under one arm, careful with it, like it was made of glass. He led me past the bookstore, past the church whose bell hadn't rung in years but was still polished every Sunday, past the footbridge that crossed the creek just before it widened into the lake. We stopped at the edge of the woods, where the trees were closest together and the path narrowed to a thread. You ever hear of the lost letter tree? He asked. I shook my head. He smiled. It's not marked on any map, like most good things here. The tree wasn't large or ancient. In fact, it looked a little crooked, like it had been caught mid-laugh. But its trunk was carved with a dozen tiny mail slots, square, uneven, smoothed by time. Gerald opened the wooden box and began placing letters into the slots, one by one. People used to write things they couldn't send, he explained. Letters to people who'd moved on, passed away, or just drifted out of their lives. They'd leave them here. And sometimes, he paused, sometimes they come back. He handed me a yellowed envelope. My name was written on it, my full name, in careful handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I stared at it. Go on, he said softly. I opened it. Inside was a letter from my college roommate, Amy, someone I'd lost touch with after a long silence we never found the bridge back from. The letter wasn't dramatic, just a memory. A funny story from a road trip we'd taken our senior year, about running out of gas and pretending we were wilderness experts while waiting for a tow. At the bottom, in tiny writing, she'd added, if you ever find this, I hope you're somewhere quiet. I hope your heart found what it needed. I don't know how it ended up in Willow Creek. Gerald didn't say. Maybe she'd passed through. Maybe she'd written dozens of letters and left them in trees all over the country. Maybe the world's full of little magic like that, messages floating, waiting to find the right moment to land. I added my own letter to the tree that day. No name, just a thank you. Spring came in slow waves after that. Theo opened the bookstore windows, and the scent of old pages mingled with cherry blossoms. Hazel, the girl with the turtle rock, brought me a flower in a jar and said, it's for your window, so your dreams don't get dusty. I started writing more, not just in my notebook, but in earnest. A story about a town where time moved like honey, and people remembered your name before you told it. A story that might have sounded like fiction, if you hadn't been there to see it. One afternoon, I passed Gerald on the trail. He was whistling something old, his basket full of letters and lemon muffins someone had bribed him with. He tipped his cap and said, you ever think about staying longer? I think I already did, I said. Part 6, The Cat Named Moon and Other Disappearances. It began, as most things do in Willow Creek, with something small and unassuming, a note on the bulletin board outside Millie's diner. Lost. Cat, gray older, responds to moon or not at all. Last seen napping behind the library. Very particular about which laps he approves. Reward offered, 1 blueberry pie. The handwriting was neat but a little wobbly, like it had been written in a hurry by someone unused to asking for help. There was no name, just a phone number and a little sketch of the cat, round-faced, alert-eyed, lounging like royalty. By the end of the day, half the town had seen the note. By the end of the week, Moon had become a topic of local folklore. Hazel swore she saw him riding on the back of a delivery truck headed for the edge of town. Theo said Moon had once walked into his bookstore, curled up on leaves of grass, and promptly vomited on the autobiography section. Gerald, of course, remembered Moon from kittenhood. He was born in the post office, you know, Gerald told me one afternoon, over iced tea and crumb cake. In the sorting bin between bills and postcards from Florida. Thought he was the reincarnation of a train conductor. Used to walk the fence like he was inspecting rails. The cat, it seemed, had left paw prints on more than a few hearts. As the days passed and Moon remained missing, a subtle shift came over Willow Creek. People lingered longer on porches. Strangers struck up conversations that started with, "Seen any gray fur lately?" There was an unspoken hope that if they looked together, not just for the cat, but for each other, maybe they'd find something they hadn't realized they'd lost too. Then one evening just after dusk, a small sound scratched at my screen door. There he was. Moon. Or at least a very convincing ghost of him. Gray fur slightly matted, eyes as steady and unreadable as river stones. He looked me over like he was deciding whether I was worth remembering. Then he stepped inside without waiting for permission. I opened a can of tuna. He ignored it. I laid out a towel. He walked around it. Eventually, he climbed onto the windowsill and curled into a perfect crescent, tail wrapped over his nose, and slept like the world owed him nothing. The next morning, I pinned a note to the diner board. Found. Moon is safe. Slightly offended, mildly aloof, deeply asleep. No pie reward necessary, unless he requests it. I kept him for 3 days before the original poster arrived. A woman named Edith, tall, soft-spoken, eyes like fog on a pond. She looked relieved and uncertain at once. "He chose to stay with you?" she asked. "Maybe just for a chapter," I said. She smiled. "That's all any of us really do, isn't it?" Before she left, she handed me a box. "For you," she said. "You kept him company, and I think maybe you needed some too." Inside was a blueberry pie, still warm. Later that evening, I wrote a new letter, one I hadn't planned. "Dear Moon, thanks for reminding me that sometimes what goes missing finds its way back. And sometimes, what you're really looking for shows up in someone else's story first. I didn't put it in the lost letter tree. I just left it on the porch beside a saucer of milk, just in case he ever passed through again. In Willow Creek, things had a way of circling back. Cats, memories, people, even the parts of yourself you thought had wandered off for good. Part 7, The Stranger with the Violin. Summer tiptoed in slowly, like someone easing into a warm bath. The mornings grew brighter, the creek ran fuller, and the scent of lavender drifted lazily through town like it had nowhere better to be. By early June, the porch swings were back in motion, and Millie's diner had set out the good chairs, the white ones with cushions that never quite matched. Everyone had shed a layer, both of clothing and whatever invisible weight winter tended to put on the shoulders. That's when the stranger arrived. She came by train, which didn't stop in Willow Creek unless you asked it to, and even then, only politely. She stepped off with a single suitcase, a wide-brimmed hat, and a violin case slung over one shoulder. No one knew her name. No one asked, either. In Willow Creek, people had a quiet understanding about arrivals. Some folks came to be found, and some came just to rest. She checked into the little inn across from the post office and rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. But every evening, Just as the sun dipped below the treeline and turned the lake into melted gold, she'd walk down to the water's edge and play. Not songs exactly, just sounds. Soft, sweeping notes that felt like rain on a tin roof or wind through a screen door. It wasn't music meant to be remembered. It was music meant to be felt. The town paused for it. People would find excuses to wander down to the water, walking their dogs, picking wildflowers, pretending they just happened to be passing by. And then they'd stop and listen. I went down on the fourth evening. Gerald was already there, perched on his usual bench with his hat in his lap and a thermos of what I knew was more than just tea. "You believe in soul weather?" he asked quietly, without looking away from the lake. I raised an eyebrow. Some folks have storms. Some folks are dry spells. Others, like her, they bring the rain when it's needed most. The stranger never took requests. She never stayed long after the music stopped. But she left something behind each time. A hush, a stillness, like the town had collectively exhaled something it didn't know it was holding in. One night, after she played, I followed her. Not far, just to the edge of the dock where she sat and dipped her feet in the water. "You play like you're remembering something," I said gently. She looked at me, and her eyes were tired in the way that only the deeply kind seem to be, like she'd carried more hearts than her own. "I play," she said softly, "for the parts of me I didn't know how to speak out loud." She opened the violin case and showed me the inside. Not velvet, not foam, just letters. Dozens of them. Folded, stacked, some tear-stained, some still sealed. "Every place I stop," she said, "I leave one behind." She pulled out a single envelope, kissed it without reading it, and slid it under the dock. The current caught it. It didn't float away quickly. Just drifted, like it knew there was no hurry. She left the next morning. No goodbyes. No forwarding address. Just the memory of her music lingering in the trees and the soft feeling that something had been mended, even if we didn't know exactly what. That afternoon, Gerald brought me a letter, unsigned, in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sentence. "Some things are meant to pass through, so we remember how to hold on." I didn't know if it was from her. I didn't need to. Part 8, The Firefly Path. It started with Hazel, of course. She burst into the post office one evening, breathless and barefoot, clutching a mason jar full of blinking light. "They're back," she said, holding the jar up like a trophy. "It's time." Everyone in town knew what it meant. The Firefly Path had returned. It wasn't a literal path, not one with stones or signs or wooden fences. It appeared once a year, usually sometime in late June, always around twilight, and always without warning. Some called it a trick of the light. Others called it a gift. Whatever it was, it showed itself for only one night. The fireflies would gather in the woods just past the blackberry grove, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them, blinking in an impossible rhythm. Not random, not scattered, patterned. They lit the way forward through the trees, like nature had borrowed a lantern and left breadcrumbs behind. Hazel tugged my hand. "Come on," she said. "You have to walk it. Everyone's supposed to." So I did. We started at the edge of the trail, where the scent of warm earth and honeysuckle wrapped around our ankles. The first few fireflies blinked lazily, like they were still deciding whether the show should begin. But as we stepped into the trees, they multiplied, golden pulses hanging in the air like whispers. Around me, others walked too, quietly, respectfully, like entering a cathedral with no roof. There were no flashlights, no talking, just the sound of summer, leaves rustling, frogs murmuring from the creek, the occasional crunch of pine needles underfoot. And the lights. The path curved gently, meandered through thickets, crossed shallow brooks, and at one point opened into a glade I'd never seen before, moonlight pooling at the center like a mirror. Some people stopped there, sat down, closed their eyes. Others kept walking. I stayed. Because in the hush of that clearing, with the air warm on my skin and the fireflies blinking above me like living stars, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. My mother, reading aloud to me by candlelight when the power went out one summer. Her voice low, the pages fluttering like wings. The story wasn't important. What I remembered was the feeling. Safety. Stillness. Like now. I sat for a long time. I don't know how long. No one watches the clock on the firefly path. When I rose, the glade had dimmed. The fireflies had begun to scatter, drifting upward, fading back into the trees like a dream at daybreak. Back in town, the bakery was still open. Theo had left a plate of warm shortbread and a pot of tea out front, with a note that simply said, "For wanderers returning." I took one, walked home barefoot, and didn't say a word until morning. The next day, Gerald passed me a stack of letters, whistling a tune that matched the rhythm of the fireflies from the night before. "You walk the path?" he asked. I did. He nodded, like that was enough. Later, I found a folded scrap of paper tucked into my coat pocket. I hadn't put it there. It read, "Once a year, the world remembers how to glow, so you'll remember how to follow it when it goes dim." I kept that one, pressed it between pages. It didn't need an envelope. Part 9, The Storm and the Diary in the Wall. It had been a long, dry stretch, the kind where even the shadows feel brittle and the birds go quiet by mid-afternoon. The garden behind the inn drooped in places, and the lake's edge pulled back just slightly, leaving a thin line of cracked clay like a drawn breath. The storm came without warning. Not the loud, angry kind. No lightning, no sky-splitting theatrics. Just a slow, steady roll of thunder far off, and the kind of rain that starts gentle and never quite gets around to stopping. By midday, Willow Creek was hushed again, but differently. The world felt tucked in. I was alone in the cabin, the windows fogged from tea and time. I'd meant to write, but something about the rain, its rhythm, its patience, pulled me instead toward the old storage nook under the stairs. I hadn't really explored it since I moved in. Just boxes and dust, I thought. But behind a leaning stack of mismatched mugs and a lantern missing its wick, there was a panel. Slightly warped. Not nailed, just nudged into place. I hesitated. Then, with 2 fingers, I pulled. Inside was a small hollow. A tin box, slightly rusted, tied shut with blue string that had long since faded to gray. It wasn't locked. Just waiting. Inside, a diary. Small, cloth-bound, the kind with frayed corners and a scent like cedar and summer sun. No name on the front. Just a year, 1954. The handwriting was neat but lively, full of loops and sudden jots like the writer often got ahead of herself. I flipped to the first page. June 2nd. The rain came early this year, and with it, the boy with the lake-colored eyes. He asked if I believed in maps that only show up when you need them. I said yes, because I think that's what love is. The entries weren't daily, but they were vivid, sketches of a life not unlike my own. She wrote about the creek, the warmth of bread from Millie's oven, the way the postman always whistled in the key of C. There were little poems in the margins. Leaves pressed between pages. One entry had a thin ribbon folded inside, faded lavender. I read for hours, curled in the window seat as the rain braided the world together. Near the end of the book, I found this. September 4th. I am leaving the diary here, inside the wall. Maybe someone will find it when they need to remember how full a small life can be. If you're reading this, know that Willow Creek held me gently, like a hand around a match, shielding the flame. I hope it does the same for you. I closed the diary and held it against my chest. I didn't cry. Not quite. But I sat with it the way you do with a goodbye that feels like a beginning. Later, when the rain slowed to a whisper, I brought the tin box to Gerald. I didn't need to say much, just handed it over and watched his eyebrows rise. "I remember her," he said softly, after flipping through a few pages. "She played piano at the inn. Wore boots in summer. Said she liked the way they made puddles feel earned. He smiled, distant and fond. She left one morning in early fall. No note, just a daisy on the piano keys. We sat for a while, the two of us, listening to the damp world outside and the soft creak of memory settling back into place. That night, I wrote again, not for publication, just for myself, for her, for the stranger who had once loved this place like I do now. Dear keeper of the diary, I found your words on a rainy day. Thank you for leaving them behind. I think I was always meant to find you here, not in person, but in pages. I hope your maps took you somewhere gentle. They brought me here. Part 10, the song that played itself. It was late July when the heat finally broke. Not in a grand storm, but a slow shift in the air, the kind of cool breeze that sneaks in through the cracks when no one's looking. I spent that afternoon sitting on the porch, watching the world breathe again, as I always do when the summer begins to turn toward autumn. That's when I heard it. A soft crackling from inside the cabin. Not loud, not intrusive, just a whisper, like something trying to remember itself. I followed the sound to the attic. I had never paid much attention to the attic. The door was always stuck halfway open, and I was content to leave it that way. But now, with the warm air and the afternoon light spilling through the small window, the attic seemed to beckon. I climbed up the narrow stairs, ducking under the rafters and dusting off the forgotten corners. And there in the farthest corner was an old record player, one of those heavy, wooden ones with brass accents and a needle so delicate it looked like it could break if you breathed on it wrong. It wasn't plugged in. I didn't know why it was there, but it felt like it had been waiting, for me maybe, for someone. I found a box of records beside it. Most were scratched and worn, but one caught my eye. The label was faded, but the name on it was unmistakable, Willow Creek's Lullaby. I gently slid the record onto the turntable, careful not to let it slip. The needle touched the grooves, and for a long moment, there was only the faint hiss of the vinyl. Then, the song began. It was soft, quiet, and strangely familiar. The melody was like a distant memory, one I couldn't quite place, but that wrapped itself around my heart anyway. A lullaby, yes, but not the kind you sing to children. This one was older. It spoke of things that were lost and found, of time moving in gentle circles, like the creek at the edge of town, of people who passed through, but left something behind. I sat on the floor of the attic and listened. The song was slow and rich, like it had been born in the town itself, cradled by the trees and the lake. And as the music wrapped around me, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't a song for anyone in particular. It was a song for everyone. For anyone who had ever lived here, or left here, or passed through on their way to somewhere else. As the needle ran out of grooves and the song began to repeat, I didn't stop it. I let it play, let it fill the air. Later that evening, I brought the record down to Gerald's house. I didn't need to explain. He was waiting on the porch with a knowing look, a mug of coffee in his hands. I heard it, he said simply. I handed him the record. It's been years since anyone's heard it, hasn't it? I asked. He nodded. The town's music, that one. People stopped playing it because it felt like it was time to let it rest. But you're right. It's not meant to be forgotten. We listened together, the night falling around us, the music settling in like it had always been here. And for the first time, I understood. The song was not just about nostalgia or memory. It was about continuity. About how, even when things change, people leave, time moves on, there is something that always returns, like the stars above the lake. Something that never fully fades. The song ended, the needle clicking softly as it came to a stop. Think it's time for it to go back? I asked. Gerald smiled and stood up slowly. No, it's time for it to stay, but we'll take turns listening. That night, I placed the record back on the shelf. Not in the attic this time, but in a place where I could find it when the silence felt too heavy. In Willow Creek, the music plays when you need it most. And sometimes, when the world is quiet enough, you can hear it again. Part 11, The Last Letter. The summer had reached its peak. The town was bustling in its own quiet way, each person going about their days with a sense of contentment that only comes from years of knowing where everything belongs, even when everything is, in truth, always shifting. It was a late evening in August when I walked past the post office and noticed something strange. A new letter had appeared on the board. It wasn't pinned like the others. This one was tucked in the small wooden box under the tree, as if it had slipped out of someone's hands and into the town's care. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat and delicate, but the words felt like they had been written by someone who had been watching the world for a long time, not with impatience, but with a quiet patience of their own. I opened it carefully. To whom it may concern. I have lived many lives, both in this town and outside of it. But there is one thing I know for sure, that the things we hold dear are not always ours to keep. And that's the way it's meant to be. If you're reading this, then you too are part of this place, whether you've been here for a lifetime or have just passed through. I leave this letter for the next person, just as I leave this town, and just as every story leaves its mark, whether it's known or unknown. In case you ever wondered, Willow Creek is a place that will always be waiting for you. Even when it's quiet, even when it's forgotten, it's always here, tucked just beneath the surface. You just have to know how to listen. Until next time, a friend. The letter didn't have a name. It didn't need one. It was simply a note to remind us that some things are meant to stay without being held too tightly. That some stories aren't meant to be finished but lived, over and over again, in little moments, in memories, in the quiet parts of our hearts. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside the pocket of my coat. I knew, even without asking, that it would be the last letter I'd ever find on that board. It wasn't the end, exactly. More like a pause, a space between breaths. I sat by the lake that evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The air was warm, but there was a hint of coolness in the breeze, a reminder that the seasons turn, even when you're not paying attention. As the first stars appeared, I felt the quiet pull of something old and familiar. Something safe. It was then that I understood. Willow Creek wasn't a place you could leave. Not really. Not entirely. It was a feeling. A memory. A letter waiting to be written again. It was the creak of a swing on a quiet porch, the sound of rain on an old roof, the flicker of fireflies against the twilight. It was always there, waiting. And as the last letter slipped from my hands, I smiled. Because some stories, like the creek that runs through it, never truly end.